Hello and welcome to another episode of Defence Uncut, the first dedicated English language Pakistani defense news commentary podcast, where we unpack Pakistani military procurements, events, and issues in laser-focused detail so that you build an accurate and informative big picture. This is a continuation of our previous episode, where we looked at the limits of the JF-17 program and how the PAF's efforts to develop a new generation fighter aircraft did not pan out. In this episode, we'll offer a high-level look at how the PAF could pursue an indigenous combat aircraft program, particularly through unmanned combat aerial vehicles. But before that, we'll do a quick roundup of some of this week's top defense news stories. So before we get to that, I just want to introduce my guests again, Asim and Arslan. So how are you, Asim? Arslan?
Good to be here.
Yeah, good to be back.
Perfect. So let's just get to our news roundup. So I think the first of these is that the PAF could win a maintenance, repair, and overhaul deal from South Africa, specifically from the South African Air Force in regards to their C-130. So according to the ISPR, South Africa is interested in using PAC for some C-130 MRO work, and I think you'll get into this, Arslan, but PAC has been really good at providing MRO services both through the PAF and overseas. So it basically ties back to the reason why PAC was originally formed, set up, and how it has largely been organized. So yeah.
So I mean, PAC has always shown itself has a history of demonstrating a really profound capability in MRO. They've always done a lot of co-production and a lot of license work other than clean sheet design. So it's pretty clear that their core competency, which is MRO, life cycle support, sustainment, and all that sort of stuff, has really been honed in on. So yeah, I mean, it makes sense. It makes quite good sense. And also probably not many other places are able to match the cost and also the quality of, sustainment at somewhere like PAC. So yeah, sounds about right. And potentially we could see this being wrapped into a larger deal as part of, another deal that may be under the works with the South Africans. Who knows?
Yeah, I think it's also worth interesting. The other South African company, Paramount Group, is basically the prime contractor for the Pakistan Navy's Sea Sultan program. And also the Pakistan Navy is setting up their own D-level MRO site for the Embraer platform. So I think there's a lot of good collaboration happening between these two countries, and it'd be really good to see if they can expand this further, especially in munitions technology, especially surface-to-air missile technology. I think the Umkhonto platform would be a really good get, as it really, at least from a technology standpoint, really aligns with some of the needs the Pakistan Air Force would have in the short to medium air defense layer. So it'd be good to see some collaboration on that front.
Yeah, or even the ADATA, which is a project that really needs a cash injection. Otherwise, other than that, it seems like, a really capable system on paper.
Next topic, the Pakistan Air Force Air Chief Marshal Babar, he basically visited the U.S. State Department, and I think that caught quite a bit of interest amongst people, primarily for the big potential news topic. For a lot of people, it's been the potential procurement of the F-16, or whether the F-16 is back on the PAF's radar. I think until this visit, everyone had pretty much closed the door or closed the book on that chapter. But it seems like, again, it's a very peculiar meeting. Just for some background, the U.S. State Department is typically the institution that will review and basically green light a potential arms sale. Now, that does include. Now, we should be clear. In addition to upfront acquisitions, it also includes sustenance deals, maintenance deals, and those sort of things. So, the air chief visiting the State Department could just be more of a routine engagement to get to secure some F-16 maintenance related deals or some C-130 related programs and that sort of thing. So it's not necessarily upfront new build acquisitions, but still, I think with the wider context at play, it seems a lot of people are really willing to, or really interested in evaluating if the F-16 could be back on the PAF's radar. So Arslan, what do you think?
Yeah, so personally, I'm of the view that ACM, Air Chief Marshal, wouldn't make this trip for such a relatively low level engagement like sustainment or that sort of stuff. I assume that would be handled by some of the lower level officers. So what I think here is potentially F-16 is one angle. There are other angles we can explore. I don't think we're going to do that today, particularly air defense and radars. But I think the F-16 is one of the angles we'll explore, and it's one of the particularly the F-16V is one of the because the balance of power in the region won't change. I think it's a much more justifiable, and it's a little bit easier to push through now among US lawmakers. So looking back at it, in terms of the F-16V, the PAF has always had a love affair, right? It's a platform they've had for decades now, and it's a platform that clearly is here to stay. Not necessarily only in the PAF, but you've got this assured support now from Lockheed Martin via the F-16V for the next 40 years, maybe potentially even the next 50 years, depending on whether Lockheed decides to push out another service life extension program, which I personally am of the view that will happen. There will be an extension, maybe 16,000 hours or whatever. Now, what people will go ahead and say is, well, why should we look at F-16s again when we've got J-10s and JF-17 Cs at much lower costs available to us without restriction and all this stuff. When we say without restriction, I think it's very loosely used because we don't actually know what the restrictions are for either side. And the Chinese have been a relatively new contender in the market, let's say, with like high-end stuff, and they don't necessarily have the same political aims as the US at the moment. So we don't actually know what the restrictions are. We don't know whether in 5-10 years they'll be the same or not. So if we look at this comparison of J-10s and F-16s and whatnot, one thing I'd really like to focus on is the F-16 has a service life of about 12,000 hours, I believe, on the F-16V and the CDs. So 12,000 hours. If we look back at the JF-17, that airframe has a life of about 3,000 hours, about 20 years. So you're getting a lot more life out of that one airframe. And this saves, in the long term, it becomes a massive plus point for the F-16, right? And the other thing I'd like to mention is the F-16 is very deeply ingrained into the PAF's DNA. Right? So it's not just a case of an airframe. It's a doctrine, it's a software, it's a deterrence, right? So there's this cohesion. It's a seamless transition for a F-16 pilot, flying a F-16C to a V. It's an evolutionary step. It's not like a whole new platform. So if you had like a F-16 pilot and then they have to transition to a J10, it's a lot more difficult, it's a lot more training, it's a lot more effort, so it's something. And it's also 40 years of tactical development, right? The PAF's entire warfighting doctrine, from like multi-squadron strike packages to air defense tactics, have been built around the F-16's capabilities for decades, and the F-16V slots directly into these, but giving you that evolutionary step up. You've got the ability to carry an absolute ton of ordnance. In some configurations, you can carry 12 bombs and 4 air-to-air missiles. There's nothing in the PAF platform that can carry this kind of payload and deliver the sort of ISR capabilities that an F-16 can, real-time BDA and recce and all this sort of stuff. And also, so if we just go back to the cost really quickly, this upfront cost is something that people tend to quote quite a lot, is the 180 million figure that they may have seen for an FMS sale for Bulgaria or whatever, versus like a 70-80 million dollar J10 deal for the PAF. The real factor they forget to look into is how long is that 180 million spread over. And also, because the PAF already has such a long history with the F-16, initial cost is likely to be a lot lower. When we really, and Bilal, you mentioned an interesting point last time we spoke about submarines, is they're a long-term purchase, so that cost is amortized over their life. And in the same way, I'd argue the F-16 has that exact same, that is applicable to the F-16 as well, because it's not a 10, 20-year purchase. It's a thing that, it's going to be around for the next 40, 50 years. So you've got that assured life cycle support, which you won't have with the J10, JF-17. And as I mentioned, in terms of cost, really, when we break it down into the numbers, potentially you might even find that an F-16 works out significantly cheaper than a J10 and a JF-17 over its entire life. Because when you're procuring these JF-17s, for example, you've got a 20-year lifespan. Maybe your procurement cycle will end after like 10 years, depending on production rates and, slowdowns, production rates and all that sort of stuff. 10 years into the life cycle, you're already looking for a replacement. And that replacement becomes costly because now you're inducting new platforms, new tactics, new crews, new support equipment, all of this stuff. So I think the F-16 is here to stay, and potentially it makes a whole lot of sense for the PAF to not go all in on Chinese, and because it's quite ironic, right? They're learning from their experience with the US, and then potentially turning back to the US to negate the effects of going all in on one supplier.
Oh,
Okay, yeah, so I'm of a few minds with regards to the F-16, sort of returning to the PAF's procurement roadmap. On the one hand, I'll always accept the reality that, look, like, especially with the Block 52s, we did invest quite a bit in setting up the infrastructure to operate them. That infrastructure exists. It was, essentially built with a long-term plan in mind. So if you actually walk back and, read some of the news articles, for example, from Flight International back in the early 2000s, like 2003, 2004, when the US essentially agreed to sell the PAF F-16s again, the PF had a plan to buy something like 55 Block 52s with an option for like another 20 more. Again, it goes back to this recurrent theme that we keep repeating, that the PF would never buy a new fighter platform unless it had a roadmap for like 80 plus units, right? And it always accounts when it determines the cost of a fighter, whether it can accept that cost. It always thinks in terms of the cost of operating 80 plus units, not just 20 units. Like if the PF's entire foundation was built on just acquiring a random 20, 30 fighters here and there, then it could have more flexibility in acquiring a higher cost platform, but that's not how to think. It thinks in terms of scale because it's in a war fighting position, right? It has to think in terms of, it is going to sustain losses. It needs to be able to have enough units to mount, impactful operations at scale. It doesn't want to end up in a situation where it had like 12 F-1 of 1970, which were really limited to a very specific subset of roles and could not do much more. It wants to have the F-86 Sabre effect. So it needs as many aircraft of that type as possible. Even when the PF inducted, for example, the Mirage 3s and Mirage 5s in the like late 60s, it basically ordered, I believe it was like a initial order of about 48 units, right, in 1967. So again, it was going in with a mindset that it was going to invest heavily in even the cutting edge platform for its time. So it's very similar here. Obviously, the infrastructure for the F-16 already exists and it should be used. Now, the challenge with America is that one problem with the United States is that policy continuity is very shaky between administrations. So, even within the same administration, like at the time of Obama, and even though he might not have been the architect, but the reality is like Congress and these things change, they switch from providing military aid to Pakistan to then cutting it off or heavily conditioning it, for example. And that is one fear the PF will have when it comes to any investment in F-16s, right? So the issue is, if they were to, let's say, hypothetically go and order some new Block 7s, the issue is that the first of those units will be, available in 2 to 3, 4 years, depending on how big the production pipeline is right now, or backlog rather. And then from there, who's the president of the US, who's in Congress, like what's their disposition, and things can get nasty very quickly, where even when you could pay in your own money with your own national funding, which for example Peacegate 3, Peacegate 4, there was a combination of both aid and national money, the US will withhold all of it and then it'll come back and give you soybeans, right? So that had left a very I would say permanent impact in the way the PF deals with the US. And if I recall, Air Chief Marshal Soleimani basically alluded to the fact of why he dropped away from the follow-up F-16 order piece, back in the mid-2010s, like 2015, 2016. The reason why he did not go ahead and sign on for those 8 units, besides the FMF issue, the other issue was that he did not agree with the end-user restrictions and some other conditions the US was putting on those fighters. Now, that was a different era, though. Back then, obviously, the US was confident in the sense that, hey, the PF could not get a great alternative to F-16s, right? But now that equation has changed with the Chinese in the picture, especially to the J-10 and potentially to the J-35, which the PF is interested in. So that gives the PF some reverse leverage, right, to basically get that assured supply. I think, there's diversifying from China and then there's going to America. Those are two different things. So I think the PF is going to approach this in a very narrow way for very specific goals. So the way I kind of see this happening is that rather than reinstitute a complete trust in the F-16 platform and use it as a way of diversifying, it could play a role in that sense, but it'll be very limited. I think what the PF is looking for, number one, as it transitions into a next generation Air Force, it'll want all of its fighter platforms to eventually have an active ESA radar. I think that's the baseline. right? And that's going to include the F-16 Block 52s. Like the F-16 Block 15s, which we acquired through the 80s, and then the previously embargoed Peacegate 3, Peacegate 4 units that were with the U.S. Air Force. Like those are older airframes. Those will probably, there's no known life extension plan beyond the 8,000 hours those units already have. So basically, those will start to basically get retired through the 20s, and that's where something like the J-35 would be a really natural transition point in the role that those F-16s have played. So in 2019, they're pretty much the nucleus of our offensive package for swift retort, from an air-to-air standpoint. Then the J-35s would play that new nucleus role, but in a different sense, like as a focal point, and we'll go into this in our later half of our discussion with regards to drones and stuff. So the J-35s could play that, forward-facing strike role, basically, or strike, nucleus role. In this context, I think what the PAF wants is that it wants its F-16 Block 52s to go through both the avionics upgrade and the structural upgrade. It already operates them, as you said. It's an easier transition. You might as well make use of the capacity you already have to operate them. There's no need to completely wind them up. That's an unnecessary waste of money, essentially. So just let's extend this further. So in that sense, I can see them pursuing both the, I believe the 6,000 hours SLEP, Surface Life Extension Program, right? That would bring them up to 14,000 hours, and then also some form of avionics upgrade. I think if new build fighters were not on the radar, I think the PAF would prefer the Turkish Özgür program. The big reason being is that the Özgür program would unlock the F-16's air-to-ground capabilities in a big way, right? So in that sense, that would allow the F-16s to basically, integrate with the Roketsan SOM cruise missile platform, their jamming pods and all this other, even the next generation air-to-air missiles. So it unlock a wider breadth of capability. The question is whether for someone like the Trump administration or an administration like that of Trump's, whether that is enough to move the needle. I think, evidently for America, the goal is to get as much work back into America in some form and capacity. Definitely the service life extension program would be a big piece of that. But I think what they're really looking for and what they really want, especially now they can see that the PAF is going around showing interest in J-35s and stuff, is that they would prefer getting new built F-16 orders. And that's really where I can see a potential tension point, both for the PAF Air Headquarters and for the U.S. administration, which might just then, unfortunately, lead to this whole scenario of just basically kind of falling through. So that being said, I think with that in mind, I think that with the PAF, the goal is to upgrade these F-16s, get them active ESA radars. They'll probably sign on. They might prefer the Turkish option, but they'll probably realistically have to sign on to the American F-16V package. New build F-16s is a big question mark simply because of that sense of whether they can trust America to follow through in delivering them. That being said, the PF does have the reverse leverage. It can, bank on and say, hey, we have Chinese alternatives. So if you don't follow up on the F-16s, then we're going to just go with the Chinese stuff. So you need to honor this contract. So that's one aspect. The other aspect could also be that, for the PAF, they also want to maintain that NATO grade fighter, which helps them still continue participating in exercises like Anatolian Eagle, potentially even expand their footprint a bit and go into more like coalitions type stuff to deepen those relationships overseas, maybe even station F-16s in foreign air bases for training or support purposes and that kind of stuff to really build those deeper, inter-air force relationships. And I think that's a very valid argument to make in that sense. And, in that sense, the investment in those 18 F-16s that we have right now would be good. And potentially they might try to stretch it a little bit, maybe look at a few new build units, in incremental orders. It doesn't seem like the F-16 plant is going anywhere, so there's no rush. So they might experiment with the idea if they have the resources for it to order a few units here and there. But I don't think they're going to pivot or make a hard pivot away from the Chinese. I think for the same arguments laid out, it would be good to continue investing in the J-10 as well. Since you have tried it operationally, you have the infrastructure to operate it and basically expand essentially with both the J-10 and F-16 in the near term, and then figure out your long-term next generation fighter program as well. So next news topic is that there was a journalist who had visited a NASTAP facility in Rawalpindi, and they wrote an article about it in The Nation, and Amr Hussain on Twitter or X basically spotted an interesting detail where he basically called out that the journalist mentioned that the PF brought out a Shepherd 3 drone, which is, developed by NESCOM, and then also a TB2 with foldable wings for carrier usage. And Amr and many observers pointed out that, hey, the TB2 doesn't have foldable wings, nor was it designed for carrier operations. That is actually the TB3, right? The larger and more capable upgrade or subvariant of the TB2. So what are your thoughts? I'll start with you, Asim. What are your thoughts about the PAF potentially showing a Shepherd 3 and a TB3?
This is kind of interesting because we actually haven't seen any videos or things like that for the Shepherd 3 that we saw for the Shepherd 2, for example, right? So we actually haven't seen any evidence that the Shepherd 3 is currently flying or in test flights. So what the journalists probably saw was a mock-up that we've also seen on trade shows, displayed by NESCOM, right? So that's as far as the Shepherd 3 is concerned. Now, regarding TB3, allegedly TB3, again, that's also a platform that Baykar is in the final stages of development of. So I don't think they're going to have an operational unit in Pakistan right now, even if PAF is interested. So it is very likely that both of these were either models or mock-ups.
And Arslan, any thoughts?
Yeah. So I mean, initially it doesn't really make a whole lot of sense. Why would the PAF go for a carrier-based, folding wing drone? But I think there is a potential merit there, where when you consider the TB2 and it's effectively for our environment, quite underpowered engine. The Rotax 9112 is an engine that I know quite well, and it's not particularly the greatest, and it does struggle quite a lot with heavy and hot environments. So that's something like maximum takeoff weight, and in the kind of operational theatre we've got, it would really struggle performance wise. The 170 horsepower Turkish diesel and the increased payload is potentially something the PAF is quite interested in. And also the TB3 is likely a lot better at handling. It is basically effectively probably a better all-weather aircraft as well. You can see it's got de-icing boots, for example, showing it's probably reasonably capable of flying into known icing, for example. So that gives the PAF more operational flexibility via higher payloads, not necessarily worried about weather issues, and also the increased performance of the engine. So, flying from higher strips or shorter runways and whatnot gives them a little bit more operational flexibility.
I think one other interesting note is the deepening relationship between Baykar Group and the PAF. So obviously, I'm of the belief as well that these were both mock-ups or models, so they weren't necessarily operational units. But that being said, is an indication that the PAF is interested in procuring one or both of them. But with regards to TB3, I think it's again an example of the PAF and Baykar Group deepening essentially their relationship across both procurement and potentially development lines. Baykar Group did assist the PAF in developing an original loitering munition, and I think that loitering munition, the Kajim V3, has all the right foundations to kind of build upon for more, I would say, like more robust effectors of that nature, like, a different strain of new cruise missiles and loitering munitions that we can use for, anti-air defense operations and that sort of thing. So there's a lot of great potential there, and it wouldn't surprise me that, Baykar Group essentially starts engaging with the PAF at a much deeper level moving forward, especially with NASTAP and helping NASTAP develop its capacity, basically. And then on to our next topic. So India's Defense Secretary R.K. Singh told CNBC TV18 that the RFI for the AMCA or AMCA program has been issued and the preliminary talks have started with the bidders. The contract for the AMCA will be awarded in the next 3 to 6 months. The first prototype, according to their expectations, is expected to fly in about 10 years. So while their in-house next generation fighter program basically goes through the development pipeline, they will be pursuing or looking at interim 5th gen fighter off the shelf as a near-term solution. Obviously, they have basically two leading options on that front with two very different implications. One is obviously going with Russia, who's been a tried and true tested partner from a fighter procurement standpoint, and go with the Su-57. And the other is basically to make that very significant leap into the world of American fighter technology and potentially procure the F-35. So Aslan, I'll start with you. What are your thoughts about that?
I mean, personally, I think the F-35 is a little bit more far-fetched. I think if India was offered the F-35, the US would wrap it up in a larger deal, require them to procure the system of systems, 15s or F-16. It wouldn't just be, okay, India here, we've got F-35s for you, they'd really likely require them to go all in and purchase, bombs and radars and all this kind of stuff, which maybe they're not necessarily interested in. In terms of the Su-57, it seems like the Russians are making a very, very heavy push. There's like a no holds barred push that, whatever India wants, effectively they can have. Sure, it is the Su-57E, not the full fat Russian Su-57, but whether it's source codes and whether it's domestic integration of systems, avionics, Indian radars, and all this kind of stuff, or potentially even allowing the Indians to absorb some tech for their AMCA program. It seems like quite a significant push from the Russians, and potentially one that will go in favor of the Russians, because the US offer, we don't know what it is. And also it's really important to note that an offer has not been made. There's been a lot of lip service by, Vance and all these kind of people, but an offer has not been made, whereas the Russians have actually made an offer, and it's something that they've been pushing quite hard. In fact, Aero India, they were effectively offering like transfer of technology of their like top of the top systems, their top line kit. So it's pretty clear that these rumors or these conversations about J-35 buys have spooked the Indians into another knee-jerk procurement, potentially. We don't know whether it will go through, but potentially into another knee-jerk procurement.
Asim, any thoughts?
Yeah, so I tend to agree with what Arslan is saying, right? F-35 is more of an ecosystem, right? So as we saw with the use of F-30 or the induction of F-35 in European air forces, it's meant as like an extension of the US Air Force in other air forces, right? So you have to deeply integrate with the US Air Force and Marines, right, to operate the F-35. And I don't see the Indians on that level of integration with the US, right? So I do feel that F-35 is a far-fetched idea. But on the other hand, the Su-57, I'm wondering, can Russia even produce enough fighters for, their export order for Algeria and then for India, right? So, and this Indian requirement is supposed to be an interim procurement for like a stopgap measure, right? So they want to procure this fast. So they don't want to wait 10 years. So I don't know if even Su-57s are an appropriate choice for India either. Then I do wonder, are there any options, right? So I really don't know.
I think if I was India, I'd be a bit skeptical with the C7 right now, primarily because, again, as you said, Asim, rightly so, it's very unclear whether Russia can honor such a large potential order from the IAF. The other side of it as well is basically, I would personally, like even as an outside observer, I would trust the Indian industry more in bringing a next generation fighter to fruition. Number one, they have learned serious lessons from the Tejas program. Again, it's very easy from the Pakistani side to just be very dismissive, but once you do actually read what has been happening there and the kind of, let's say, the kind of progress that they've made in a lot of the critical technologies you need for a fighter program, and a big one being flight control technology. They had to develop that indigenously, for example. They have a very good industrial and development foundation to support the AMCA. And on top of that, they can also cross-leverage their relationships, especially with the French, and to an extent even the Americans where possible, to basically fast track things, right? So in that sense, I would say that they should, from their standpoint, the ones who have a clear vision of this are going to want to prioritize the AMCA above importing Russian fighters, because the big lesson that they've learned both in 2019 and now is that they want to wean themselves off of the hodgepodge systems integration mess, and they want to consolidate on some unified platform, and they have a political goal of making that unified platform indigenous. So for them to then suddenly pivot, and they'll probably look at the Russians with some skepticism, because look, it suits the Russians to see the AMCA fall a little bit or fall behind a little bit. So that could result in a diversion of budgetary resources and attention and engineers and human resources and what have you, going into supporting the 7 and trying to adapt it for Indian operations and so on and so forth.
Yeah, and another thing I wanted to say was the Tejas was, or one of the things that Tejas was a victim of, was the IAF choosing to import other aircraft over the Tejas, right? And so the Tejas never really was good enough for the IAF, and they kept choosing other aircraft. So if I were an Indian planner, my decision would be to not import another 5th generation fighter for the interim. Because A, there's no urgent need, and B, it's probably going to stymie any efforts for the AMCA, right? What I would do instead is leverage India's good relationships with USA, Russia, and France for critical inputs that India can probably, import, like engines or radars, right? So if I were an Indian planner, that's what I would focus on. And I would not think about importing another fighter, because let's suppose they import another fighter and then in 10 years or 15 years, they're going to have 2 5th generation fighters. Do they really want to repeat this hodgepodge of various fighters again? So I think not, right? So if I were planning for them, that's what I would do.
One thing, I believe what the offer from Russia was that Indians would be able to produce them at their Nashik facility at Hal, which could potentially be roped in as like a means of fast tracking AMCA as well, using some of the stuff the Russians have developed for the Su-57. I doubt the Russians have done anything that the Indians wouldn't be able to do, but as a potential means of fast tracking their own project as well, I can see that sort of happening. And also, potentially the Russians could divert some of their own Su-57 orders to India for that initial batch while they set up the production line, or transition the production line into a Su-57 one.
So now just kind of looping back to the F-35, I do think, and it's a bit of a far shot, but there is one scenario where India could procure the F-35, where it could make some sense, especially from that ecosystem standpoint, and that would be through the Indian Navy. Now, the Indian Navy does have a lot of that core supporting infrastructure acquired through its other American platforms, like the Poseidon platform, the Romeo Seahawk platform, for example. So I can see, and I believe they signed or they got approval for some like wider Pacific integration system from the US as well. So the point being is that the Indian Navy, because it's a smaller arm entity, it doesn't deal with any Russian fighters. Or, I mean, yes, it currently deals with the MiGs, but those will be replaced by the Rafales. But in the long run, it won't have that situation, whereas with the IAF, it'll have the Su-30 legacy going on. So I think with the Indian Navy, they could potentially be the target customer for the F-35. The question is, how would that fit into their concept of operations and stuff? Like, would it be like a carrier-borne fighter? If so, would they need to invest in something less complex as the F-30? Would they need to then go back and redesign one of their future carriers for the F-35C? So there's a lot of questions in that sense, which opens up a much bigger discussion. But I think of India's service arms, I can see that the US has the most interest in the Indian Navy. Number one, that is the entity that would ostensibly come to help in any Asia Pacific security situation, right? Like in the Pacific Ocean. And the second being is that a lot of that core infrastructure and those elements have already been put in place and could be adapted through existing Indian platforms. Like, for example, they could, in one of their future frigates or destroyers, configure that with American sensors and surface-to-air missile systems, or they could develop a variant of the Barak series or the LRSAM series to work within the American system. Like these options exist in that environment, and it'd be at a much smaller level than what the Air Force would require, because the Indian Air Force has to think from a territorial defense standpoint, right? Both against China and against ostensibly a rapidly growing PAF threat, right? So I think from that standpoint, there is that scenario, but that being said, the Rafale order probably would have stymied that potential as well, but it's something the Americans could bring up as a conversation standpoint with the Indians. Okay, and speaking of fighter development, I think we can now segue into Pakistan's fighter development. So, last episode, we basically discussed some of the drawbacks with the JF-17 program and, and some of the constraints that led to the collapse of Project Azam and the rise of Project PFX. So with that context in mind, Asim and I, and now Arslan is joining us for this discussion as well, we believe that there is still significant scope for Pakistan to develop original air combat platforms. But the opportunity, especially with the way war is changing and how technology, especially in the area of software and electronics and sensors, has really made air warfare a much more platform-independent reality, has opened up a lot of great opportunity from a development standpoint for countries like Pakistan to finally kickstart the aerospace industries in a realistic and independent way. And the area that we highlighted that should be the starting point is that of Unmanned Combat Aerial Vehicles, or UCAVs. So let's just get started. But before that, Arslan did have to drop the call. He has an unstable connection. Again, don't worry. He will be back with us as usual once he's back in the UK. But until then, it'll just be Asim and I for the rest of this episode.
Yeah, so if our listeners recall our last podcast, it was the punchline was there are two things that Pakistan does not have for developing a fighter aircraft. And those two things are A, money, and B, in an industrial base, right? So those are the two things that we don't have. And fortunately, to develop a UCAV, those two problems get solved very, conveniently. The first one is industrial base. Now, Pakistan actually has a significant industrial base developing UAVs, UCAVs, and cruise missiles, right? So Pakistan has developed Shepherd 1, 2, and now 3, the Barak UCAV. It has also developed cruise missiles like the Babar, Rad, Temur, right? So it has a lot of experience doing that. It has the industrial capacity to do that. It has, trained manpower that understands how to develop these, and design, develop, and produce these systems. So, like you said in the last podcast, there's if you went to, like a place like NESCOM and told them to develop a big UCAV, they would see a route to that because of the work they're doing, right? So we do have the industrial base. The second thing is UCAVs are much cheaper to operate because obviously they're in general much smaller. They have less stringent safety requirements, right? So you need to certify less things. You can make them for cheaper. And because they're smaller, you can, power them with maybe a cheaper jet engine or a turbofan or something like that. And it's easier to find experienced people for this sort of thing. So that also makes UCAVs cheaper. So the two problems that you would have developing a manned fighter are exactly the two problems that you will not have developing a UCAV.
Yeah, and I want to add one thing here is that it's also an opportunity to sort of put to bed any potential rivalry between NESCOM and NASTAP. Like, one of the challenges of having redundant organizations doing redundant work is that you end up with them sort of competing. And, competition is good when it's, productive in a market. But we're talking about two state-owned entities, right? Which are going to be competing for a finite budget at every level. So that sort of competition is toxic competition. That's not market competition. So that needs to be put to bed right away, right? That needs to be buried and forgotten. So for this to work, there needs to be some level of interoperability between NESCOM and NASTAP. And I think there could be. For example, NASTAP has, yes, NESCOM is much more experienced in developing those more, traditional air-to-surface munitions, and it's become advancing its design. So it's moved from like the Rad to the Rad 2 to the Temur to the Rasub. So there's a good evolutionary chain there, right? And that's really good from the standpoint of potentially arming a future J-35 purchase. However, I think NASTAP, by coming in a bit fresh from a new starting point or a fresh starting point, was able to go ahead and develop, with Baykar's help, that miniature cruise missile, the Kajam V3, which is a much smaller application compared to even the Rasub, right? We're talking like, I think it was like the Kajam V3 weighs something like 30 kilograms. So it's very light for what it is. But it gives you a different sort of technological basis to approach things from. So you can have one player like NESCOM work on the more complex, larger platforms, and then you can have NASTAP come in and interoperate and develop the smaller, more disposable platforms. A sense of the two could work together in different areas. Or likewise, I think NASTAP has a bigger emphasis as well on things like cybersecurity, AI, and these sorts of things. So it can take up greater ownership of the autonomous agent aspect of a UCAV, leaving NESCOM to focus more on the airframe and industrial sciences. So there's a lot of potential here where they should be brought together in the same room to really discuss and come up with a unified UCAV plan, as opposed to just being tasked to do it independently and come up with unoptimal competing solutions, basically.
One thing I'll just add to that very excellent point is that industrial base that I talked about, that's entirely with NESCOM. That's not with the NASTAP or PAF, right? So if, NASTAP goes ahead and says, we're going to develop a UCAV on our own, then you're stuck you're back to square one where you don't have any industrial base, right? Because the industrial base at NESCOM is basically invisible to you, right? So like you said, there needs to be like a higher level determination by someone on top of NASTEP and NESCOM that, for example, tells NESCOM, hey, you're going to develop the airframe, and then maybe the AI pilot is going to be developed by NASTEP, for example, right? So that decision needs to be taken. This cannot be a siloed program with either NESCOM or NASTEP, right? This needs to be a joint thing.
I agree. And NASTEP, whereas NESCOM has that industrial infrastructure advantage, NASTEP has the advantage of being a lot closer to the public domain compared to NESCOM. So NESCOM, as Asim, you discussed last week, was that it's a very heavily regulated, security-centric entity, right? Information does not move laterally as easily within the NESCOM divisions as it could within NASTEP, because in NASTEP, it's a much more like fluid, I think, business-friendly environment. Like, for example, in NASTEP, you literally have foreign OEMs setting up offices within NASTEP, which you could never, it's unheard of in NESCOM, right? So I think in areas where you need to rapidly build up skilled labor from the open commercial market, like cybersecurity, like AI, like machine learning, NASTEP has the advantage of doing that quicker. So that's its competitive advantage that it should double down on and leverage, especially its ability as well to also work with foreign OEMs where it can, while you leave NESCOM with the more traditional structural infrastructure, airframe related work, which requires more controlled technologies. They're hard to come by. You want to leverage the infrastructure for both sourcing and procurement and integration and manufacturing that's already there. So can you break down some of the advantages that a UCAV would give? I think, for example, some of the reasons that you had sort of posited, they sort of speak to some of the lessons the PAF might have learned from the recent conflict.
Right, so we need to look at a couple of things, right? So as we discussed at length in the previous podcast, development, design, development, production of manned aircraft is an expensive thing that Pakistan probably cannot do and should not be doing. And then we sort of know that UCAVs have some very specific advantages over manned fighters, and they're becoming exceedingly clear as, technology develops. One of the main things is the ability to operate relatively independently of Air Force bases, right? So in the main, May episode with India, we saw that, Air Force bases were attacked. Not to come off as an alarmist, but you could imagine a situation where India could launch a saturation attack of, BrahMos or something like that disables, maybe 2 or 3 Air Force bases of the PAF. And that's a big hit for PAF's ability to generate sorties, right? And, that would be a very bad thing for Pakistan's fighting abilities. So having a way to generate air power independent of Air Force bases would be a huge deal. And so there are examples of UCAVs operating without airfields. So a very famous example of this is the XQ-58 Valkyrie. And there's several videos of it being launched using rockets. Because remember, UCAVs are much smaller, so it's easier to launch them either using rockets or if they're small enough, using like a catapult, right? A pneumatic catapult, or even a short semi-prepared run, right? So because the weight is small, it doesn't need, huge landing gears, and the design is much simpler with regards to that. Another advantage that UCAVs have is they're a very cheap way to augment numbers, right? So we know that PAF always struggles to maintain numerical parity with India, right? Because India is a much bigger force, and Pakistan always tries to create local areas where it has numerical superiority, right? So numerical superiority is is an important thing to the PF. So with UCAVs, they can augment their numbers for much cheaper than if, let's say, they went and bought more fighters, for example. And the final advantage that, hinted at as well is that they can perform high risk missions that you would not, give to manned fighters. Again, to go back to the May conflict with India, after, May 7th, on the first night of the aerial combat, essentially both air forces were so afraid of losses that they were not entering each other's airspaces to do any sorts of attacks. All attacks were being done either by India using BrahMos or Pakistan using Fatah ones on May 10th, right? So there were no significant, air battles or air strikes, right? So UCAVs, and the reason for that is you don't want to lose a pilot over the enemy's airspace. And also you don't want to lose an aircraft because that's very expensive. So UCAV solves both of those problems by giving you a cheaper alternative that isn't manned, so you don't lose a pilot if it gets shot down. So you could perform higher risk missions. So if, as we're playing hypotheticals, if on May 10th PAF had access to UCAVs, it could have sent several of those and attacked, targets deep inside India instead of launching Fatah ones, which are arguably very expensive because once you launch that missile doesn't come back, and it's a big missile, right? The aircraft probably, or at least some of them, will come back.
Yeah, and I agree. And one other thing from an industrial standpoint, or like I said, our aircraft R&D standpoint, is that with UCAVs, you suddenly get, especially if they enter full-scale production, then you get like these smaller aircraft in very large numbers helping you collect data and further fine-tune and develop your R&D, which could then be re-leveraged in the future towards a manned platform, right, when the time comes, which is something you don't typically get in traditional aircraft R&D. You might have these like smaller technology demonstrators like Iqbal, and then they go out and help you with testing. But with the UCAV, you can test the core technology over and over and over and over again and iterate very rapidly with each production cycle, right? So it's suddenly your ability to develop those critical inputs like flight control technology, composites, survivability elements, and sort of thing. They get field data very quickly without you having to put someone's life on the line. And I think that's another big aspect that sort of gets, underappreciated.
Yeah, and if there's one, moral of the story is that the steps that Pakistan needs to take need to be incremental, right? So Project Azam was, as we discussed in the previous podcast, was way too many steps at the same time, right? So we know we do UCAVs in terms of Shepherd 1, 2, and 3 now, and we do cruise missiles. So a bigger UCAV, like a 2-3 ton UCAV, is the logical next step. And, maybe manned fighter development is 1 or 2 steps after that. But you need to take this step because you can't jump, R&D.
Exactly. And it's worth evaluating or like revisiting the history of a lot of these other aircraft programs, because you'll notice that, for example, with Turkey, you had an intermediary step before the Khan, which was the Horde Jet program. You look at the Japanese, for example, before they even joined the 6th Gen fighter program, they had, I believe it was the Kinshin platform, for example, their technology demonstrator. What a UCAV project would do is take the role of that technology demonstrator, but help make something practical out of it. So it doesn't become just a pure R&D engineering studies money pit, which is valuable, but maybe in Pakistan's case, you have finite funding. You can't really exert that much money into a one-way street like that. So UCAVs will provide you that thing that you can continuously develop and test and trial out and then build data on, which can then be leveraged for bigger platforms later. So on to the next part, Asim. From here, what is the starting point of a UCAV project? Where would we have to start?
So any aircraft program needs to start with defining of the mission. So when we define a mission for an aircraft, it doesn't necessarily mean that that's the only mission that this aircraft will do. It's usually a couple of missions that the aircraft is designed for, and then that sets the requirements, and then you design, your aircraft for that, and the eventual aircraft is flexible enough to do several other missions. So for example, we know what the F-16 was initially designed for, right? It was designed for air combat, but eventually it was able to do much more than that, right? A mission is a useful starting point, but it's not the end, limit of what a platform can do. Now, in terms of Pakistan's UCAV program, we need to think about what we are developing this UCAV for. So, first of all, it's the Indo-Pak environment, right? So it's for the PAF primarily, right? So we might export it, but it's primarily for the PAF. And then it needs to, so I don't know the answers to these questions, so I'm just raising them and, asking hypothetical questions. So does PAF want to conduct deep strikes into India, right? That could be one mission. Another mission could be to augment the air-to-air fighting capability of PAF fighter sweeps, right? So that could be another mission. You could design an aircraft that has an internal payload that can, or a combination of internal and external payloads that is, capable of enough of carrying either air-to-air weapons or air-to-ground weapons, right? So all of these things need to be, decided upon before you embark on a program. You can't just say, oh, we want a UCAV because this sort of design looks nice and fancy, right? You can't just go ahead and say, this UCAV being developed in the United States looked nice, so we should develop one just like it. No, we need to sit down and deeply study what the PF wants, what kind of mission PF wants to conduct, and then design our UCAV around those requirements. Traditionally, this sort of thing is done using historical data. So for example, you are going to collect data on hundreds and, probably hundreds or maybe thousands of UCAVs that are in service around the world. You're going to tabulate every, specification of that UCAV. So for each UCAV that you store the data for, you'll have things like weight, maximum range, maximum takeoff weight, all those specifications that you use in aircraft design and performance. And you'll feed that into a database, and maybe you'll fit a curve, or I shouldn't say a curve, of mathematical function whose job it'll be that, you could tell it things like, I want a UCAV that weighs 2 tons, can fly 300 miles. What does that UCAV sort of look like, or what's the payload that this UCAV is going to have. So you use these mathematical models constructed using historical data to roughly direct your efforts in terms of designs, because you're not going to know immediately how big your UCAV design needs to be. So you're going to use a lot of historical data to inform that decision. And like I said before, this decision needs to be heavily influenced by what the PF wants.
I think now in relation to that, I think in terms of requirements, the one area where I think the PAF would definitely be interested in, especially with UCAVs, is the deep strike capability, especially as like a near term objective, simply because and this is both for the PAF and the IAF, that after the after the May 7th engagement, there was an apparent chill on both air forces, because they knew that an aircraft loss over the other's territory would just be catastrophic for morale. So before crewed fighters even go in across the border, they would need to deprecate enemy air power significantly. So I think with the Indians, they basically came to a conclusion that one effective way for them to do that would be through using the BrahMos cruise missile, using heavy saturation, loitering munition tactics and that kind of thing. For the PAF, it would be basically, again, potentially a combination of using, again, high speed, high velocity missiles, like potentially like something built on the CM 400 AKG, potentially acquiring a supersonic cruising missile and so on, but then also having the UCAV element to actually push strikes and, have that level of, let's say, because once you fire a missile, the margin of being able to make it go somewhere else, to change its target or to, adjust its, let's say, to improvise using it goes down. Whereas with a UCAV, the margin, essentially you're basically replacing the crewed fighter with an uncrewed fighter, so the margin to operate and to improvise and to do on-the-fly thinking goes up, right? Whether it's with an operator or not. So, and we'll go into that later, and whether the challenge is autonomous agents. But that being said, I think with the PAF, the vision likely is that, okay, we have our stealth fighter, the J-35, for example, at the core, managing a family and ecosystem of different types of drones of different sizes. One of these would be like a 2-3 ton UCAV that would go across the border and take on the bulk of the risk. So it'll be the sponge against India's surface to air missiles. It would do very aggressive maneuver, very aggressive 7-8 ton platforms, but those are coming down much later. But the other side, I think, is also cost effectiveness. So that goes into your point that, it might not look like the most fancy drone. You just need something that gets the job done for the role that it was, for the mission that it was assigned. And in the case of the PF, that's the trade-off. It's like, yeah, you can have a very complex UCAV, but you sort of get back to the same challenge. Like, do you want to lose these drones in numbers, or do you want something that's a simpler design that just has, much more, I guess like a much more uniform mission set. So it's specifically designed for that strike role and, attrition absorption role, and that's what it's going to be used for. So I think that's like the PAFs, from my understanding, or where the PF would likely look towards. That's just my thought.
And you pointed towards or hinted towards a very important thing, that is autonomy. Now, autonomy means different things to different people at different at different times, at different eras. Right? So in the 2000s, autonomy just meant that the aircraft could take off on its own, go to a waypoint, come back, land. Right. So that was the prevalent definition of autonomy, in the right? And that sort of autonomy is already present on UCAVs that are in service with Pakistan. But that is not the autonomy that we're talking about when we talk about UCAVs that are coming online these days, right? So, for example, we have America's, what's it called? The CCA program, right? The Combat Collaborative Aircraft Program, right? And they have two aircraft for it, the Anduril YFQ-44 and the General Atomics YFQ. Now, an interestingly funny thing about the YFQ-44 is it actually started off life as a target drone, so a very large but target drone. So that should tell us, that it's very possible to take the know-how and knowledge that you have in developing, UCAVs, cruise missiles, target drones, and leverage that to develop a UCAV, right? So I was talking about autonomy, right? So what does autonomy mean these days for the for example, the CCA program, or, a loyal wingman drone? That sort of autonomy is you basically give a much higher level mission to the AI pilot, as it's called. So, for example, the mission could be, give a specific target in India, for example, and you say, go hit that target and avoid getting shot down. So that's the only mission, you'll give it. And then the aircraft itself, or the AI pilot will figure out, how to take off, what route to take to target that avoids enemy air defenses that it already knows about, right? What weapons to use, where and how to deploy those weapons, and then how to best return safely, right? So all of this stuff, the AI pilot will figure out on its own. So that's what we mean by autonomy these days. Another mission could be something like a Growler mission, right? So we could say to like a flight of UCAVs, go into this area, bait any air defenses into turning on, and when they shoot at you, suppress those enemy air defenses using anti-radiation missiles, right? Or like a mission like that. And then return when you're, out of ammunition or something. And so this could be the entire brief to the aircraft, and the aircraft figures out everything on its own, right? Another mission could be, go take off and augment the air-to-air capability of this flight of JF-17s or whatever, J-10s, right? And then this flight of UCAVs is going to data link with the JF-17s, and the JF-17 pilot might, give it additional instructions. For example, it could ask the UCAV to act as a missile sponge, right? So to take incoming missiles so that the JF-17 can lob its own missiles. Or it could ask the UCAV to maintain track on a target on which the JF-17 is launching missiles at, right? And while the JF-17 deals with something else, for example, right? So these are the kinds of missions that you could feed to the UCAV, and that's what we mean by autonomy. Now, autonomy is actually a great challenge and a great opportunity at the same time. Now, it's challenging because it's obviously hard to do, right? It's hard to get an AI system to do all of these things, right? To understand all of these missions and tasks and be able to execute them. And like we discussed earlier, NASTEP is ideally situated to work on developing an AI pilot. So that should be their goal in this hypothetical UCAV program. Now, why do I also call this an opportunity? It's an opportunity because an AI pilot does not require a lot of funding or R&D expenses to develop, right? Because you don't actually need aircraft flying around to train and test your AI systems. You can do all of this in computer simulations, which you can, run hundreds of thousands of. Yes, of course, you need to invest in computer infrastructure, but it's way cheaper than, flying aircraft and possibly crashing some of those, right? So in this day and age, it's very easy, or I shouldn't say easy, I should say it's much cheaper than it would have been even 10 years ago to develop this sort of AI pilot. And the other great thing about developing this thing, which almost everyone who develops these knows and is one of the reasons they're developing this, is that once you develop a single AI pilot, you can copy that pilot as many times as you want, right? It's literally a matter of Control-C, Control-V, right? You cannot do that with an actual pilot, right? You need to train that pilot. It requires years of training, and then they need to train on a specific aircraft. It's a very time-consuming and expensive thing. But once you've developed an AI pilot, that AI pilot can go into every UCAV you fly, right? And that's a huge thing. So that's the great opportunity that exists with the development of a truly autonomous AI pilot. And that's something that, companies like Shield AI in the US are working on and are very far ahead. And they have a habit of, releasing a lot of their, the things that they can do. That's a good benchmark of, what NASTEP can use to, as NASTEP can use like as a benchmark for their AI pilots.
I agree. And I think it's also worth noting that for NASTAP, the opportunity here. So, one of the challenges for a lot of personnel, skilled professionals who go into the armed forces is that the skills that they develop, especially in the engineering maintenance side, I can speak to this because, I have family who have done this, is that your skills are very much tied to the platforms that you've worked with, right? And you become a specialist in those platforms. So there's very limited scope for dual use, unless you become like a civilian defense contractor, which is the ideal scenario after retiring, is that you don't have much of a scope to repurpose those skills to do other things. Now, the thing about software development and then AI in these areas is that the people you recruit into NASTAP to do this work and thrive in it, they become over time highly valuable professionals in those fields. So they have this incentive to be in the defense R&D sector to develop that capacity. It sort of becomes like a positive investment in the sense that, defense expenditure is a necessary investment, but the point with this line of work is that the people who will go through NASTAP and then reemerge out of it will have the skills to be competitive in the global marketplace, right? It helps the Pakistani economy, right? Because suddenly you have these people who have done practical AI related work, then suddenly that they can then export those services as consultants and what have you, or straight up engineers to other countries as well for like different applications, right? Like for space research, for example, or like mining and what have you, whatever. But the point being is that it's a very malleable line of investment that does have like for NASTEP to invest in this skill capacity pool. It's like investing in the country's economy as well. It's the closest you're going to get. And it can have significant windfalls in the future because, again, like the physical infrastructure to support this does not have to be that intense. Obviously, as you start developing more into AI and develop the AI infrastructure and ecosystem, you're going to need data centers and that sort of thing. That opens up a separate opportunity in the Pakistani economy as well. But the point being is that compared to aerospace, which is just fraught with so many controls and export restrictions and limits and politics, like this is an area that you can get the Pakistani labor pool engaged in relatively sooner and upskill relatively quickly as well. So it's like there's a lot of wins in this sort of pathway.
Yeah, and let me just emphasize what I was saying about this being a great opportunity for Pakistan. Because unlike traditional aerospace projects, there are basically no restrictions on developing an AI pilot. All you need in terms of investment is banks of computers. You just need to go out there and buy, graphics cards and computers and hire a bunch of computer scientists and aerospace engineers and pilots, of course, and ask them to develop this AI pilot. It might take several years, like it might take 10 years, right? But the product at the end is going to be very unique, very powerful, and you're going to be able to create a lot of value out of it. And as you said, it's going to obviously employ a lot of, talent in Pakistan that is currently, as we know, leaving the country, primarily to go to aerospace companies in the Gulf countries, right? So I just really want to emphasize that this is something NASTEP can do, right? Because right now, the things that they've primarily invested in is office space and, pivoting to aerospace production where, factories or machines is difficult. But what they can realistically do is get a bunch of computers, get a bunch of people, and start them on developing Pakistan's AI pilot, right? Put that AI pilot in an aircraft that NESCOM develops, and then Pakistan can be, the world's expert on creating a loyal wingman drone, right? And that drone could be the drone that, comes with TFX, right? Or Turkey's Khan, right? Or the Jet 35. So whenever Turkey sells a Khan, they sell 50 Khans, they're all selling 150 Pakistani UCAVs with Pakistani AI pilots. That stuff is going to be inbound.
Another thing is NASTAP can also close the skill gaps relatively quickly through this approach, because it's not an issue. Again, you don't need complex tooling and stuff to take this work on. Like, in addition to the computational infrastructure, you need AI researchers. And you can find them, and you have to pay them a premium, but more likely than not, many of them will be interested in coming for a good, valuable project in Pakistan, right? If it's a valuable legacy building project. So you can find AI researchers in places like China, the United States, Europe, and especially like even within the United States, given the situation that's happening there are people who are now looking abroad for opportunities. So you can find AI leaders, like genuine leaders in their fields, to help and just infuse that knowledge and know-how within the Pakistani AI space. And again, the advantages here is that you build your skilled labor pool by just directly feeding from the civilian labor pool, which is very underused, and they're looking for jobs. The value from an economic standpoint, as we said earlier, is that, look, the investment that goes into AI development through NASTAP will then have, residual effects across other sectors, and it'll leave a skilled labor pool that can then, compete for exports overseas by just literally exporting knowledge, services, and AI technology, basically. And then there are other residual effects as well that go into like hardware spaces, where some Pakistani companies will notice that there's so much AI development is happening within the country, they might try to build applications for it in the real world, right? Like such as like more robotics and what have you. So this is a huge opportunity for a country like Pakistan to really establish itself. It just takes a bit of not just vision. I mean, we can have a lot of vision in Pakistan, but it's more of very clear task-driven execution and delegation of responsibilities, and actually like collaboration between the different R&D entities. Now, that being said, there are some structural challenges, Asim, right? And I think the two big ones you flagged were basically power plants and data links.
Yeah, so when we are talking about a 2 to 3 ton UCAV, that is essentially going to be jet powered. Now, the options for those sort of jet engines are limited, but they're much easier than, if you were trying to get an engine for a GF-17 type aircraft, right? So it is an issue, but it won't be such a huge issue, because you could either get those engines from China, right? Or you could get some of those, get Turkey to invest in engine development for this UCAV by, selling this UCAV as a companion wingman to the TFX. So this could be a great way to link this program into another program and get some benefits out of it, right? Now, with regards to data links, those are very important, because I did talk a lot about autonomy and AI pilots, but at the end of the day, you do need a communications link to your UCAV. This is easier when it's between aircraft flying with the UCAV, like for example in formation, because the ranges are so much closer that it's easier to keep those links encrypted while maintaining high data rates. But it gets increasingly more complicated once you're, doing these links over large distances, like for example, a deep strike mission. And the biggest challenge becomes keeping these data links secure. And the best way to do this is, again, with lots of software development and having a robust presence in space, because you need satellite communication to establish links over long ranges. We've sort of seen hints that Pakistan is interested in these, because as we've seen with Shepherd 2 and Shepherd 3, they seem to have the characteristic bump on the top of the nose that is due to the presence of a satellite communication dish, right? So Pakistan's UCAVs do have that. Or so there might be a plan to, deploy our own satellites, or perhaps use Chinese systems. But that, that factor is obviously still there. Also with data links.
So, and I just want to make a point about the engines and power plants. So I think for like a 2 to 3 ton UCAV, you're looking at around 10 to 15 kilonewtons of one turbofan engine with about 15 kilonewtons thrust. Definitely Pakistan does not manufacture anything like that. But the advantage of a UCAV program of this nature is because you're looking at such incredible economies of scale, even for domestic requirements, much less export, that the economic justification for investing in such an engine is very easy. It's an automatic yes, right? Because you're going to be manufacturing this engine by the thousands over the not just the life cycle of your current drone, but potentially future drones as well. So that's, I think, a key factor to get to where we are. I think right now our indigenous turbojet, the NTJV1, is like 3 to 4 kilonewtons. So from there to 15 is a 3x jump from a performance standpoint. It's a big jump, but again, there's a way to get there. The ones, NESCOM can see it. So I think, especially if, NESCOM was to collaborate with peer countries, and we'll get into this in a bit more detail towards the end, such as a Turkey, a Ukraine, a Poland, and Brazil, who developed a lot of the core infrastructure and industrial capacity to design such engines. If you were to collaborate with them and share technology, like exchange our know-how for their know-how, then we can definitely develop this engine indigenously and manufacture it at scale. It's doable. Again, it's just an issue of maintaining the right vision and then executing correctly. And just as a pivot or a segue to the next section, which is basically the industrial benefits of a UCAV. So as you can see from just the discussion Asim and I had up to this point, is that it's something that's accessible to our industry, and it's a means for us to expand our industry, right? As Asim noted, we have an industrial infrastructure under NESCOM. It's under a lot of controls. And I think one of the ideal transitions to see, especially through a UCAV project, is to start delegating more of the production work to the private sector. The nature of a UCAV is that like the PAF would need many of these units, right? It's expecting to use them and then, potentially lose them in a war and then have to rebuild its fleet. Other countries will be interested in acquiring such platforms as well, and that too in serious numbers. So all of a sudden, there is an inherent incentive for private investors to get in on the production side, right? However, that takes Pakistan will have to revamp its export controls and red tape essentially to make sure that this is done properly, so such that the commercial activity can prosper without compromising on security. It's doable. I mean, America does it, Europe does it. There's no reason why Pakistan cannot do it. It just requires our policy leaders to revisit the old rules and then, essentially replace them with new rules, basically. But that being said, the one big advantage of delegating to the private sector, especially the production side, is that you take the overhead, the wages, the salaries, and all this like weight off the state expenditure, right? Because one of the things we want to do with defense spending in the long run is to remove these like fixed albatrosses, like fixed overhead, fixed infrastructure, manufacturing infrastructure, even pensions and these sorts of things, and move them into other areas such as a pension investment fund to move production into the private sector, because then this allows the defense budget to be used for procurement and actual wartime operations, right? So we get maximum utilization out of it, as opposed to spending a growing percentage of it every year on just things like on like dead infrastructure. Like for example, if the state-owned industries like Nescom keep taking on production infrastructure, the problem is they're going to have to end up maintaining all of it. And it's very hard to tell public sector employees, the workers on the factories, to go and find a new job, right? Because the nature of a state-owned entity is you give people the long-term pension and long-term support. So that all has to get eaten up into the defense. Basically, the defense budget has to then support that. And if you keep building all the infrastructure in the public record, in your defense budget in the long run is mostly going to be spent on maintaining this, as opposed to procurement and modernization. And that's the problem we want to now avoid and then reverse. And the way to do that is you basically delegate the production to the private sector, which are more efficiency focused, right? They're focused on generating profit and generating ROI from their investments. And they will be better suited to be more agile and moving into improving their production processes, into going into acting for exports and that sort of thing. And that is the end state we want to get to. Like, it's not just a question of the UCAVs and strengthening the PAF. Like, in addition to that, we want to then also fundamentally strengthen the Pakistani economy, especially the industry, right? So that it's able to provide people with the livelihoods to be able to live in the country and have buy-in into the country, right? As opposed to just being spectators all the time to wherever the government or the military is doing. And that is the vision, I think, we want to also maintain from an industrial standpoint.
Yeah, so let me just emphasize that when we were saying that Pakistan's going to produce, or we want Pakistan to produce hundreds of UCAVs every year and export, thousands, we were not saying that, Nescom should start producing these. Nescom should be the design house, and this is something we've discussed previously as well, that they're actually very design heavy, right? And it's the production capacity that's lacking with these organizations. And it is rightly so, right? Because it makes no sense for them to take on production capacities and establish production lines for these sorts of things. And it's entirely natural for them to rope in the private sector for these sort of things, right? So they're going to design this UCAV, right? And then they're going to give the designs and, to some private company and say, here are the jigs, you manufacture, 50 of these each year, and we're going to buy these from you, right? And then Nescom could install their own, avionics on it or whatever, right? Or you can, split these things between different, private companies. But the point is, this sort of production capacity is not, especially for UCAVs, which are going to be produced in much larger numbers than, current UCAVs like, Shepherd 1s or 2s. These numbers are not possible or realistic for organizations like Nescom. These are not ballistic missiles that you need maybe 300 of, right? You need to produce like maybe 50 of these every year. So it only makes sense that the private sector is roped in for, things like these.
Absolutely. And once the private sector becomes adept at manufacturing these aircraft, then they'll find that they will become good at manufacturing other aircraft. And suddenly now, as like the point we made about NASTAP and, producing this whole ecosystem of, computer scientists and what have you, it's similar within the private sector on the manufacturing basis, because they're going to find that, look, they have this capacity to produce, composite materials, to forge certain sorts of aerospace grade steel, to even design and manufacture the jigs necessary to be able to assemble these UCAVs for other companies like within Pakistan. Like this whole ecosystem, they're going to find that they're going to need to re-leverage this to continue driving profitability in the long run. And that's where, if you ever question why doesn't Pakistan's exports ever cross, why don't they ever cross 100 billion, 200 billion? This is why, because we don't provide this ecosystem. But if you were to use if you were to use this one UCAV program and architect the industrial base for it this way, then you will have the industrial ecosystem to drive those huge exports, right? Because suddenly, let's say like ABC company in Pakistan can go and turn around and say, hey, you know what? Let's invest in an original UAV design for transporting, logistics or something. Right? For example, they design it. They're the ones now commissioning the design and development of this, right? So there's not even the military who's doing it. Now you have the private sector going into this so they can produce something for the civilian market. And then they're going to go overseas and be one of those few countries that are offering a cost-effective, non-American restricted logistics drone system. it all works like this, and this is where you build those competitive advantages in different fields to be able to compete in the global economy. And this is where the Pakistani economy would start to, start to fire off, right, and start to bring in hard currency gains and really start driving employment and benefits. Because the one Pakistani factory making UCAV is going to create an ecosystem of jobs in other areas like housing, services, and so on. And those areas, as they grow, they create an ecosystem of jobs to support their employees and so on and so forth. This is how it's done. And so I think like one of the underlying messages here is that, start at a more accessible level with your development as a military, but then start to really think about how you can, think of the vision of how you can extend the branches of this work and its benefits to as many sectors and people in the country as possible. It's basically the idea of nation building and having a vision, right? And that's the approach that if we had policy people, they would take, basically. Yeah, so Asim, next part, and I think it goes into the point we kind of touched on, but basically once we develop these UCAVs, then that would develop Pakistan's, unique selling advantage, basically. It's, USP, the smart UCAV maker.
Yeah, definitely. So that's my vision for this UCAV program. And obviously I'm nobody, but, if I was in charge, that's what I would be focusing on, because that's really a low-hanging fruit, and that's something we can do. We have the ingredients for it, and it's, you can almost smell it, right? It's just right there.
Once again, I thank all our listeners for joining the Defense Uncut podcast for this week. I thank you, and again, don't hesitate to reach out if you have any questions, comments, or ideas. You can reach us at podcast@kuwa.org. Once again, take care and bye.